Thank you for that very nice introduction. And good morning, everyone, and to those online as well. I'm delighted to be here in Bucharest and to be speaking at this national colloquium at the Institute for the History of Religions of the Romanian Academy. I want to begin by expressing my sincere gratitude to the director of the Institute for the History of Religions, Eugen Churtin, for the invitation to speak today, and to thank Eugen and Stefan Lungu and all involved in organizing today's colloquium. It is truly a privilege to be here during what is my first visit to Romania. I feel privileged to be part of an event at the Institute for the History of Religions at the Romanian Academy, as it is such an important institution in the Romanian academic study of religions and is recognized as an important institute in the critical study of religions on a global level. I will speak today about how we theorize the study of religions, the conceptual categories we use, and the implications of such categorizations. And so I hope this talk will not be too tedious, but I have become quite preoccupied with terminology and our own meaning making in the academy. The way we organize knowledge and convey it, both in academic fora and in the public domain, in turn solidifies others' understandings. Indeed, scholars of religion introduce theorizations of religion and culture that can be polarizing, because these theories mean something for people's identities and sense of themselves. Through examining my positionality in the areas of religion, folklore, and cultural studies, the nuance and subtlety of terminology has been brought more to the fore. In this keynote address, I consider selected categories and definitions utilized broadly in our field in how they relate to my own research areas of popular religious tradition, new religious movements, and esotericism. In doing so, I attempt to highlight assumptions in our field that need to be reflected upon. My background is a folklorist who moved into the study of religions. I was for over a decade in folklore department and in that field before moving over into study of religions department and some different but interrelated approaches. And I do ethnographic research, which would fall into the anthropology of religion. My research areas encompass otherworldly traditions, sacred geographies, and popular practices, and also new religious movements and esotericism. As an anecdote, when I am invited to speak on Irish television and radio about my research topics, the reception and mood of the interview often depends on whether I am described as a folklorist or a scholar of religions, despite the fact that I might be on the show to speak about the exact same topic. Introduced on air as a folklorist, there tends to be a light-hearted mood and questions from the interviewers such as, "Do you believe all of these things you were told?" Or, "Have you ever seen a fairy?" However, when I'm introduced on air as a scholar of religions or from the university's Study of Religions department, the atmosphere is usually quite serious, with more pointed questions about society or identity. While this is just a general tendency I've noticed, it highlights different cultural responses. These experiences led me to think more deeply about how my culture informs how I think about religion and about culture, and how academia in general is informed by the sociocultural and political contexts we are raised in and live in. After all, the social sciences and humanities are not dealing with controlled facilities like laboratories where things are tested and measured, but we are dealing with people. People are always involved in a meaning-making process. They are not external to it. And as researchers, we are always part of that, whether or not we do ethnographic research. The theoretical schemas that human beings create are intended as models that can be applied objectively and impartially, but the very creation of theoretical schema or categories involves value judgments about something out in the world. As academics, we understand our field through conceptual categories which help us to interpret the world around us, to analyze phenomena. In turn, we communicate our findings within our scholarly community and beyond it. Our field of study of religions, perhaps more than any other, interrogates our internal terms and concerns itself with precise definitions, schema, and categorizations. This preoccupation was in part caused by efforts to distinguish our field of study from theology. So a few points about theology and the study of religions. Perhaps the most confident characterization of the field of study of religions is that it is not theology, as pointed out by Professor Kimnott and others. It's as with many, assertions of identity or what something is, we define it against what it's not. In endeavoring to show that the study of religions is not theology and to firmly establish what it is, scholars have carefully and precisely delineated meanings and approaches. As Kimnott has remarked about our field, we would find it difficult to identify common theories, methodology, practices, norms, and structures upon which the majority of scholars could agree. This is because of the different disciplinary and methodological perspectives involved. The theologian Schubert Ogden stated that theology must appeal at some point to special criteria of truth to establish its assertions, or that the theologian must believe these assertions to be true, even before seeking to establish them. And he went on to state that specifically religious studies are represented as different from theology, mainly because they require no appeal to special criteria to establish their assertions as true, and because they require no prior belief in the truth of their assertions from the student of religion. While it is the case that we scholars of religion take a critical and non-confessional stance, we aim to understand religions that we study from as objective a standpoint as possible, making no claims to truth. It does not mean that we are not influenced by our broader cultural context in how we think about the subject matter that we study. Remarking on the relationship between theology and religious studies, Christine Helmer remarks that often theology appears as the negative foil to the study of religion. Lived religion is opposed to abstract, dogmatic propositions. The empirical study of devotional practices is contrasted with the prescriptions of religious authorities far removed from the reality of religion and everyday life. And the value-neutral academic study of religion is preferred to the subjective imposition of theological doctrines. As Helmer has highlighted here, the study of religions asserts an approach that is purposeful in understanding religion as it is lived, rather than imposing claims about truth or reality onto the world. While scholars of religion do this work very well in gathering information about religiosity and analyzing it in different ways, another challenge that needs to be addressed in our area of study is the impact of cultural understandings on how scholars of religion think, even if this attention is paid to semantic expression of meanings and what things in our society might be worthy of being spoken about with reverence. So, some points about the category of folk religion. Since this colloquium deals with the theme of religious history of Europe, it is interesting to turn to a reflection of how religious materials have been collected from European peoples and the culturally constructed category of folk religion as having a similar cluster of meanings and images associated with it as so-called peasant religion. Susan Narodsky remarks how, as a concept, the term peasant is critiqued for its lack of clarity and inappropriateness in the present. The term peasant and peasantry are still used in scholarly literature, albeit more so in folklore scholarship in a seemingly unreflective way. While the term peasant arose in the 15th century from the Old French paysan, meaning country dweller, akin to the meaning of the Latin word paganus, and was used in an economic sense for an agricultural worker or small-scale farmer. As the word came to be used in English, it's always had an association with class. Peasants are conceptualized in a rather pejorative way as people of low social status with a connotation of lack of knowledge. In the literature, peasantry is often used synonymously with folk, and it has been, to some extent, through this lens of the constructed folk, the imagined folk, that we also see folk religion. Alan Dundes makes the point that one might expect this narrow 19th century definition of folk as European peasant to have disappeared, but it has not. One rarely hears the music of the American Indian, he says, or Native American, referred to under the rubric of folk music, or the art of the Australian Aborigine listed as folk art. Folk music and folk art still tend to be restricted to European or European-derived cultures. It could be argued that these terms, as used today by some scholars, have the same nuance as when they were used historically by those of high social class, in this construct of class, for those who they considered beneath them. There is a cultural influence that was generated in Europe during the Romantic movement, and this has influenced academia also, even though this influence may be subtle. Romantic nationalism of the 19th century had a bearing on how people and their practices were viewed. Romantics, writes Giovanni Costigan, drew a distinction between nationality and nationalism, between the nation as the vehicle of moral and spiritual values and the nation as a political power tending to aggression and imperialism. Thus, spiritual values and cultural expressions became increasingly important in forming national identities. Romantic nationalists wished to recapture elements of ancient cosmology and truths. Costigan remarks on Romantic nationalism and the yearning for what he calls the sense of depth in history, involving a passionate quest for the origin of national roots in a remote past and an idealization of folk culture. This idealization involved much attention to the spiritual aspects of people and also the connection between the otherworldly landscapes and sites associated with magical practices, ancient religion, or legends. For instance, in the Irish context, there are numerous examples of how the Anglo-Irish or so-called ascendancy class or gentry, as they're known, used the term peasant. Birgitte Bramsbeck remarks that folk, to William Butler Yeats, for example, meant above all the largely illiterate people of the Irish countryside, peasants, farmers, fishermen. For many participants in the literary revival, Ireland's countryside and the so-called peasantry that inhabited it, she says, were the nexus of spiritual values and a link right back to the Celtic world. Living close to the land, farming and fishing and sense of place were together emotionalized in a picture presented of the Irish nation, and popular lore, particularly Irish, was a vital source of inspiration to Yeats and other writers of the Celtic revival. There exists much academic work on the topic of the imagined folk, and it is therefore incongruent that the word peasantry would be used today in connection with the culture or religiosity of the general population. As Irish folklorist Kevin Danaher described folklore as the sayings and doings of ordinary people, one might posit that there are no peasants and never were. There are just ordinary people with lived religion, or by another definition, vernacular religion. As Leonard Primiano states, vernacular religion is, by definition, religion as it is lived, as human beings encounter, understand, interpret, and practice it. I am by no means dismissing or negating the rigorous scholarship and careful attention to definition of both folklorists and scholars of religion. My point here is that there is a cultural strand of meaning that has persisted from the 19th century and that is still identifiable in how the religion of European peoples is conceptualized in a general sense, and how this impinges, mostly understatedly, on some academic work. The study of folk religion is most often the study of the mixture of official or institutionalized religion and so-called pagan or unofficial forms of religion. James Capello, in his research amongst marginalized and minority peoples in Hungary, Moldova, and Romania, remarks on the category of folk religion as what he calls the product of the European experience of religion as a discursive field dominated by Christian churches, nation states, the ideology of romantic nationalism, which is currently resurgent across much of Europe, and Enlightenment and secularist thought. In this regard, he says, folk religion only becomes meaningful in the context of European modernity, when folk and religion acquire their respective semantic loadings and meanings. It could be argued that we as scholars who are socialized and live within either largely secular cultures or those that are hegemonically Abrahamic are viewing popular religion and culture inevitably in contrast to or in comparison with Abrahamic religion. We are influenced by religious understandings encountered in our societies, whether or not we believe them ourselves. While cultural baggage is considered and addressed within ethnographic writing, it is perhaps not sufficiently explored in the study of religions theoretically in a general sense. As a way of elucidating my point, I will move to the topic of pagan studies. One of my research areas, as I mentioned, is new religious movements, and I have conducted ethnographic research on contemporary paganism in Ireland. So nature religion, people who self-identify as religious practitioners of druidry, witchcraft, also various forms of neo-shamanism and so on. Since beginning my research in pagan studies in the early 2000s, and later moving into the study of esotericism, for me, mostly literary and historical interconnections with esotericism in the Irish context, I've noticed a preoccupation among a certain sector of academia with whether or not scholars are also practitioners. Marcus Davidson, in his review essay titled "What is Wrong with Pagan Studies?", critically examines a specific publication, the Handbook of Contemporary Paganism, in an attempt to illustrate the field of pagan studies as he sees it in general. He states about this handbook, there are 4 reasons why such a critique of pagan studies is an urgent matter. Firstly, pagan scholars, working from an explicitly pagan and insider point of view, outnumber scholars who study paganism from a critical naturalist viewpoint. In the handbook, the numerical strength is 17 to 7, which seems to reflect the field in general. Secondly, he says, this numerical superiority has allowed insider perspectives to dominate the study of paganism and to isolate and shield the field from theoretical and methodological discussions within the study of religion in general. This isolation has to be challenged from without, and doing so should be a concern for our whole discipline. Thirdly, he continues, the dominance of insider approaches in the study of paganism makes it difficult for students and scholars who are not experts in the field to identify those excellent and academically sound publications on contemporary paganism which do exist. Fourthly, he states, while paganism is particularly religionist, the problems of this field are illustrative of much as what is wrong in the academic study of religion in general. Similarly, Egil Asprum's and Kenneth Granholm's introduction in their co-edited book, Contemporary Esotericism, state, so-called pagan studies is a problematic field, which often seems more interested in developing neo-pagan theology than conducting unbiased and critical scholarly investigation, a comment which seems to ignore the insights garnered on the lived religion of pagans, their identities, traditions, and activities, as found in the many ethnographic studies of contemporary paganism conducted in a variety of sociocultural contexts since the 1990s. As Adam Onchik and Matusz Węczalek say, marking sharp borders between ethic and emic research and researchers, between pagan and non-pagan biased academics, does not help in any way to develop the discipline. Diversity and plurality of views enrich our research. Dialogue and critique from both sides is a tool for making pagan studies more recognized in a broader academic context. Davidson's critique of pagan studies and other criticisms of the field would only be a fair appraisal if it was applied across the board in the study of religions. I'm not leveling my criticism at Davidson necessarily, but at the field in general. When it comes to being an insider, a practitioner, or going native, it is overwhelmingly a concern scholars express about their colleagues who research new religious movements or esotericism in our field today. Very rarely is this concern expressed about scholars who research an Abrahamic tradition. In fact, it is generally a non-issue in our field when Christians research Christianity, Muslims research Islam, or Jews research Judaism, and so on. This is also a cultural matter because of the status of Abrahamic religions in our world. While Brian Howell and others have explored the insider-outsider complexity and ethnographic reflexivity in this regard in the anthropology of Christianity, and Louise Ryan, Eleanor Kaufman, and Pauline Aaron, among many others, have examined insider and outsider identities when researching Muslim communities. For example, it is not presented in the same way as the question of whether scholars are practitioners of magic, for instance. It could be argued that this difference in concern with religious involvement of scholars is related to cultural assumptions about the nature of belief and what is real or true. Such dialogues and debates are complex also because of ontological and hermeneutical limitations to understanding. How do we really know what an individual privately believes? Magic and esotericism are still marginalized in our cultures. Indeed, Wouter Hanegraaff has defined esotericism as rejected knowledge and counter-normativity, those aspects of knowledge which the historical academy and mainstream society dismissed as unscientific, or in the same way as Enlightenment thinking dismissed the magical practices and things like charms and cures practiced by ordinary people as superstition and irrationality. Despite the emergence and grounding of pagan studies and the study of esotericism within the wider field of the study of religions, the broader cultural context in which this has occurred hasn't really been considered across the study of religions as a whole. What appears to be needed is a conscious, intentional, and transparent examination of cultural presumptions at play and how such dynamics work within our societies. So connected to this is how scholars speak about mythology and religion. So a related point is the various definitions of mythology as distinct from religion as a category. I have found in my research that mythology is core to contemporary pagan discourses and practices in the Irish context. First, to give some context for Irish mythology, so in the case of Ireland, strands or aspects of ancient religion or pre-Christian paganism continued under a Christian veneer, and since medieval times, the popular practice of Roman Catholicism has maintained some so-called pagan elements. An added complexity in understanding Ireland prior to the arrival of Christianity is in how medieval Christian scribes compiled the texts that we now call Irish or Celtic mythology that had been passed to them from an ancient oral tradition. Thus, it can be argued that the surviving myths have been filtered through Christian worldviews long after the pagan world ceased to be. Scholars conflate the categorization of Celtic mythology, Irish mythology, and early Irish literature. From the contents of the medieval manuscripts, it is evident that some stories and elements must have been orally transmitted for centuries before they were committed to writing. There are other significances to the medieval manuscript material in that the stories and accounts in the texts interconnect with the landscape and sites of the island of Ireland. In general usage, there is a distinction between the mythological or written tradition and the oral tradition or folklore. because the corpus of material is medieval manuscripts where we get this information. Of course, in the oral tradition, there can be variants of the stories found in the corpus of written material that have been passed down through time, transforming to suit different cultural contexts during each telling. Therefore, with regard to categorizations, there is some convolution when we apply the terms myth, legend, and folklore, if by these terms we mean different things, to living cultural traditions. So the terminology we use for people's practices and identities is always problematic. For the pagan community of modern Ireland, the most significant connection to make is with the Celtic deities. Some would avoid the term Celtic, others embrace it, but I won't go into that here. And also Celtic and pre-Celtic sites and symbols. When we speak of Celtic cultures, in the absence of extant written materials from Celtic people themselves, we are reliant on two sources of information. The first source is written materials, which includes scant references in classical sources and the literature compiled in medieval times, largely by Christian scribes in the Irish context. The second source is archaeological materials. Pagan practitioners often augment gaps in knowledge about the pre-Christian past by a selective combination of elements of archaeology and folklore alongside the mythological source material. This shows a resilient religion, one where practitioners consciously and deliberately utilize any source available to engage with their gods. These cultural resources are then recontexted as means to gain insights into the otherworldly realm, and from a practitioner perspective to venerate the deities as appropriately as possible. Experiences at sites coalesce with dreams, visions, and other experiential knowledge, or gnosis, and pagan discourse frequently contains references to embodied experiences, feelings, and senses. There are also some barriers to accessing the mythological material, not just for pagans. The early Irish texts are written in Latin or in Old Irish language, the latter texts being the oldest surviving vernacular language texts in Western Europe, dating from the 8th century to the 10th century. Therefore, this literature represents the most extensive material of all of the branches of Celtic mythology. Other countries have less texts or ones that are not as old or as well preserved. The Old Irish language in some of the texts consists of glosses or annotations written between the lines or on the margins of religious works in Latin. Most of these kinds of manuscripts were preserved in the monasteries of Switzerland, Germany, France, and Italy, where the early Irish missionaries had brought them. Then there are texts with largely Old Irish language content, the oldest of which is the Book of Armagh, dated to around the year 812. So some of these texts have been published in modern Irish and in English translation, and there are academic studies of them. Many pagans in Ireland engage with academic materials, whether literary or archaeological. In fact, as a demographic, contemporary pagans are quite well informed about their own religious history. They have knowledge of religious history, both in the sense of the emergence of the modern pagan movement. Generally speaking, most pagans would have that kind of knowledge of contemporary paganism itself and different forms of contemporary paganism, but also about ancient religions and cultures. Indeed, I have found in my interviews with pagans in Ireland that many practitioners are well informed about the academic study of contemporary paganism. With their awareness of sources from which we learn about religions of the ancient world, I have found that many pagans are cognizant that it is not possible to reconstruct the ancient religions, but rather to be inspired by what can be known about them to create a new paganism for today. Even when those in the Irish pagan community engage directly with the medieval corpus of written mythological material, they are also informed by the oral tradition. Myths and legends of Irish folklore form part of the discourses of pagans and influence their practices. Sabina Magliocco, in her article titled reclamation, appropriation, and the ecstatic imagination in modern pagan ritual, states that myths, sacred narratives about the actions of gods and culture heroes, are another popular font of source material for pagan rituals. But when we claim, as scholars, that myth is a source material or a core part of a religious tradition, what exactly do we mean? As a scholar whose academic training was in folkloristics, who then changed discipline to move into the study of religions, I have become somewhat preoccupied with what this means to have mythology as central to a religious tradition. In a basic sense, if we go back far enough in time, myth is living religion, a collection of stories about deities and otherworldly beings. There is often a marked difference between what scholars across different disciplines mean when they use the term mythology and folklore, and when they use the term religion. Despite all of the interrogation of the term religion and whether or not the world religions paradigm should be used, there is still the common association of the term religion with established institutionalized systems of belief and practice, or as the actuality of practice of lived religion. Mythology, conversely, is in some cases viewed as something belonging to the past, but still lingers today. Yet, when we select a characteristic of a cultural tradition to examine further, this imagined boundary between mythology and religion can disappear. When we try to set down precise definitions for broad application, we find that categories can blur instead of making the distinction clearer. Complex and long-standing processes in the world, including colonization of indigenous peoples, the impact of Enlightenment rationalism and the scientific paradigm, and the special status of the Abrahamic faiths in the world, have led to a cultural dichotomy between religion and mythology. There are, of course, disciplinary specific understandings of what myth is. There are semiological approaches to myth by Roland Barthes and others. But here I refer to popular perceptions of what the word myth means, so these cultural understandings. John Mills, in his essay titled Deconstructing Myth, remarks on how the transliteration of mythos as myth has acquired many significations, many of which have centered around a story, and adds that unlike in Homer, where there is no distinction of true or false narratives, modern and contemporary references to myth have acquired a pejorative meaning that stand in relation to derived etymologies from antiquity, where discourse on myth began to be viewed as fiction and fable. This concept of fiction or fable is found in the popular mindset by way of the phrase, "it's only a myth," to mean something that isn't true. Accordingly, there can be an implicit assumption outside of academia that religion is real and mythology is not. There are children's books of mythology presented in the same way as fantasy stories. There is the tacit understanding among some that a mythology is simply a religion no one believes in anymore. What then of contemporary worshippers of these gods, goddesses, and spirits? Some definitions of religion rest on the internal coherence and meaningful frameworks, but then we get into an examination of longevity. It is likely that what we call myths are stories that remain from cultures and civilizations that are now dead and gone by this definition, but the religion, when lived, would have been coherent and consistent. In many cases of ancient cultures, we are putting information together piecemeal, as we are relying on fragmentary literary stories, oral traditions, and archaeology to try to understand the bigger picture. As Jose Manuel Losada remarks in his essay, Cultural Myth Criticism and Today's Challenges to Myth, we can no longer think of nor live myth like it was thought of or lived in ancient or Christian times. The main reason is that the realm that favored the origin of those myths has disappeared, and so have the conditions of its interpretation. Other definitions would have religion as what is institutionalized or formalized, a structure or system of beliefs and practices with associated dogmas and doctrines, while myths are stories contained within this religious system or this meaningful framework. However, this is not a satisfactory distinction either, since there are many forms of religiosity that are outside of institutional and formal systems. We have academic categories, as discussed previously, of folk religion, what some call religious syncretism, some call the New Age, alternative religion, new religious movements, esotericism, and mythology can come into all of those kinds of categories. None of these definitions adequately delineate where mythology ends and religion begins, or delimits them satisfactorily as separate things. If we are addressing two separate things as scholars, we need to clearly define them. If myths are the literary content of religion, for instance, in the case of the early Irish literature, this use of the term being equivalent to the corpus of Irish mythology, we must ask ourselves why there is not the same engagement with the mythological texts we find in the Bible, Quran, or Torah. We rarely hear academics use the term Christian mythology, for example, but we more often hear descriptions of Hindu mythology or African traditional religions being described as mythology. Again, this relates to the cultural status of the text in the world and of the status of the Abrahamic faiths generally. When we consider the possible reactions of religious adherents of Christianity, Islam, or Judaism to their sacred texts being described as mythology, we must think more deeply about what it is that they are reacting to. Lauri Honko comments on this very issue in his article, The Problem of Defining Myth, where he explains the first thing that one realizes in trying to grasp the semantic implications of myth is that myth can cover an extremely wide field. Without resorting to an enumeration of the different ways in which the term is used nowadays, he says, it is clear that myth can encompass everything from a simple-minded, fictitious, even mendacious impression to an absolutely true and sacred account, the very reality of which far outweighs anything that ordinary everyday life can offer. He says the way in which the term myth is commonly used reveals too that the word is loaded with emotional overtones. These overtones creep not only into common parlance, but also somewhat surprisingly into scientific usage. He says that myth does in fact carry emotional overtones in this way. The fact that myth carries emotional overtones in this way is perhaps most easily seen if we think of terms such as prayer, liturgy, ritual drama, spell. They are all used for different religious genres, but would seem to be more neutral than myth. It appears to be difficult, he says, for many scholars to discuss myth simply as a form of religious communication, as one genre amongst other genres. I would suggest that the emotional resonance is tied to cultural assumptions about sacrality and reality. What is the difference in sacred stories? Is a story a myth if people claim it to be literally true? Philosopher Bernardo Kastrup, in his book More Than Allegory on Religious Myth, Truth and Belief, has discussed the notion of what he describes as religious myths being actually true and not allegorically so. Who decides on whether a story from the distant past is to be understood as literally true today? Does it come down to being an insider or outsider to a particular religious tradition as to whether a story is a myth or a religious truth? If the myth as sacred story is the defining feature, then surely all such stories with religious content should be described as myths. When we try to answer these questions, we find the terms mythology and religion become even more slippery and start to escape our grasp. In conclusion, despite careful attention in the academic study of religions to categories and terminology, there remains a set of underlying cultural assumptions that can impact on our understanding of religions and religiosity. In fact, our understanding of the category of religion or religions is inevitably situated within our own research endeavors and relates to our precise research topics, and also therefore informs our research questions and approach. While this may seem axiomatic or very obvious, it is something we need to consider further as scholars and to reflect on the ways in which culturally constructed terminology influences us in creating our typologies and models of the world. Thank you. So your first question was about you're asking how the practices are transformative. So with the kinds of paganism that I research, so Druidry, different forms of pagan witchcraft, and also people who self-identify as a shaman. So within the pagan context, that's different from an indigenous person who academics are calling a shaman. So what is transformative for the practitioners, what they talk about is, well, many things. So like I touched on things like embodiment. So many people have, I would say that it's the phenomenological is important because it's a ritual. Well, as I've found, ritual is very important for most pagans. So the practice is a way of expressing oneself. There's creative dimension to it, but it's also a way of dealing with things. It's been analyzed in different ways psychologically and so on. So there's, people have talked about just that sacred connection that they find through ritual practice, whether that's with deities, and not all pagans would understand deity in the same way, or magic in the same way. But they talk about connecting, for example, with energies as what is sacred in their life, with nature and natural cycles. That's what gives meaning to their lived experience. And many people in the Irish context have also talked about the being able to the freedom to express what they believe without being told what to believe, that lack of dogma that maybe they were raised with, if they were raised Catholic or Protestant, for example, and also the different structure of things rather than going to mass, for example, if they were raised Catholic, in the practice of Wicca or Druidry. Like with Wicca, people are initiated sometimes into a coven or ritual group, sometimes into the religion, depending how it's understood, and they become clergy. They become a priest or priestess. So for some, that is very significant. It's to do with just that gnosis or inner knowing, and a spiritual journey that is more free. Like people have used the word that freedom quite a lot. So that I would say there are many reasons why it's transformative for people, this kind of religious practice, and there are various kind of ecological concerns, and people have talked about being pagans, being guardians of the earth or protecting the earth. So that is also a motivating factor and part of why it's spiritually significant and transformative. So they're just some examples. And can you repeat the second question? Because it's
Does this research lead to a terminological or epistemological shift, or simply it's just reordering of how these phenomena are viewed using the new tools? I mean, if it is a very powerful shift into the research, if it's, if you define the terminology, the concepts, if it is in itself a transformation, a transformative way of redescribing this phenomena. Thank you.
I don't think it's anything really new in terms of methodology. I think it's using the same ethnographic tools to do field work as in like classic anthropology. I think it's just maybe a new focus for study of religion, a relatively new focus in documenting and analyzing, through that lens of lived religion. So to also consider, to broaden the definition of what we understand as religions and cultural movements, and to document it as it's happening. That's it's I don't think all that new. What may be the relatively new thing within ethnographic research is things like autoethnography, which is becoming more acceptable as the researcher being an insider. So there is that shift to that being acceptable, whereas in early anthropology, this idea of going native as something that's had a kind of negative connotation. But I think understandings of culture are changing as well. So
they are doing, for example, meditation, Buddhist meditation, and they are using to write down articles based on microphenomenological phenomenology, and an interview. They just try to offer a sort of mirror of their own experience, translate it into a scientific framework, and it is interesting to read them. Thank you. It depends where you put your attention, but it is a living phenomena, and it's the interesting thing is that they try to find a sort of ways microphenomenological interview, and maybe you know about that, and this is interesting. I don't know if it is reliable. I think they try to do an experience, right, and a sort of translating their own experience into something scientific. I don't know if it is quite orthodox, but however, there is still on literature we have such examples. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I have 3 questions. You answer whatever you want. My first question is, you mentioned that you are first a folklorist and ethnographer, and after that you became a historian of religion. And I would like to know what are your favorite authors in regard of folklore or contemporary magical practices. For example, my authors are Claude Lecoteau and Dominique Camus. They are folklorists from France. My second question, Lecoteau. My second question is if you can speak a little bit about differences and mutual influences between the old Celtic religion and the old Germanic religion. It's a broad subject, I know, but just a few. My third question is if you can talk a little bit about approaches and differences between the study of history of religion in Europe and the history of religion in the United States.
So my favorite theorists or authors, it's a difficult one because I have to pick a research area. I would say with esotericism, I mean, Professor Wouter Hanegraaff is, has just been so impactful on how we think about esotericism as scholars, and really, influence the development of the field. If you can repeat the second question, you were talking about the difference between Celtic
and older Germanic religion and magical practices, because they are close but also different in the same time.
Just Germanic. My knowledge would be limited about Germanic practices. I know, like I only know, I've read some ethnographies of contemporary heathenism, for example. Dr. Jenny Blaine's research on Saith magic or heathenism in the British context. There's also, ethnographic studies like Jefferson Calico's book Being Viking, about the American context. So how it would relate to my research, the concept of the Celtic or Celtic spirituality is quite important for many Irish pagans. And this is also a romantic construct. So while I said that, there are those cultural resources like the literary, mythological material and archaeology that are informing contemporary Irish pagan practice, there's also the romantic impulse that's going back to late 19th century, early 20th century in Ireland and Europe more broadly. So I think there's an interesting dynamic there that also brings in an interest in esotericism. The people who collected folklore material in Ireland were also, many of them were practicing occultists. So there are many kind of influences on the imagined Celtic or a Celtic golden age. And I think that's one of the main things that makes it distinct from the Germanic. There's often more, with the Nordic and the Germanic practices, there's often more information on ancient practices, or, they were recorded in a different way often. So that's a difference. There's a big gap in knowledge between, contemporary Celtic practices and what the actual Celtic peoples might have done, because we don't actually know. We don't have any existing accounts from pre-Christian peoples in Ireland or Britain, or any other Celtic region. So I would say that's a main difference for contemporary spiritual expression, what the sources are.
Thank you so much. I may only add that Professor Wouter Hanegraaff from the University of Amsterdam will be one of us in September with a splendid panel which would include the luminaries of the esotericism study worldwide, and that in general there will be the leading scholars in your own fields gathering in Bucharest, where 20 years ago we were the hosts of the first panel on esotericism, at that time coined Western esotericism, and during the Congress in 2006, one of the keynote lectures was Professor Antoine Fèvre, which is a good name to mention that today we will have an English and en français public lectures by our colleagues. And in the morning session, there are 2 more episodes of our meeting, for which I thank all the people following us on Zoom online and the people who came indeed to the Romanian Academy Institute for the History of Religions. And I would like to thank once again Professor Butler. And you know, this is not only a collaboration which started this year. We know each other from Vilnius, Gothenburg, Krakow, more recently, congresses, European congresses, and this is the big European family. And so thank you so much for crossing the entire Europe to come to the easternmost Institute for the Academic Study of Religions in Bucharest. Thank you so much, Jenny.
Thank you.